Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 82, Lucien Bonaparte, Napoleon's fiery brother. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of our listeners that if you'd like to support our podcast monetarily, please go to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon. Once there, you'll find three options available. We have a $2.50 a month option, a $5 a month option, and a $10 a month option. As always, we appreciate all donations. If you'd like to support our podcast in other ways, please go to our YouTube page and give us a follow or hit the subscribe button. As always, we thank you for your support. Now, on with the show. We have a terrific guest yet again, our good friend Graham Callister, joining us from York, England. Hello, Graham.
Hi, John. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us again.
Absolute pleasure. Great to be here.
Yeah. For those of you not familiar with Graham, he's been on our show a couple times. He's fantastic, really knows his stuff. And he actually has a new book coming out pretty soon. It's a Waterloo book. Would you like to tell us about it, Graham?
Yeah, absolutely. It's called Waterloo, the Attack of First Corps, and it's about the first major attack, really, at Waterloo by d'Erlon's First Corps on the Allied centre-left, the French right, which really is a moment that gets a bit overlooked in the battle. It's overshadowed by the excitement of the attack of the Guard later and the drama of Hougoumont and the glory of the cavalry charges and the glitter of them. But this attack on the Allied left really is, a pivotal moment in the battle. So this book really examines what's going on there. The units involved, does a really forensic, detailed analysis of French First Corps. So the book's really about that.
Okay. And the two commanders, actually, d'Erlon and Picton, were actually covered by Graham and I in episode 69 and episode 73 of the podcast. So if you want to go back and listen to those before you read the book or after you read the book, really interesting commanders, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. The two guys are fascinating. So if you haven't listened to the episodes, please do go back and have a listen to them.
Perfect. Yeah. Speaking of interesting personalities, we're going to talk about a guy of the Bonaparte family, and we're not talking about Napoleon or Joseph. We're going to talk about Lucien today. He was a fiery character for sure, but a little different from the older two brothers, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It is really interesting that these Bonaparte brothers all seem to have quite different personalities. They are born over a kind of 16-year period, which is a period of enormous upheaval, first for Corsica, of course, being taken over by France, and then in their youth and adolescence for France itself as it drifts into revolution. And maybe that shapes their personality. But Lucien is a really interesting character. He's perhaps the most similar to Napoleon in being quite politically driven, quite passionate, wanting a career in politics, but he's maybe more idealistic, and that causes in some problems, as we'll maybe see later on.
Yeah, he reminds me of Napoleon and somewhat his sister Caroline. He's very headstrong compared to some of the other family members. So you're right. He does have a lot of the political drive and ambition that Napoleon has.
Yeah, he definitely seems to. And he also has a bit of pig-headedness and a bit of stubbornness that will not necessarily serve him well.
No. Yeah, we'll get to that here in just a bit. But let's dive in. He is born in Corsica, like his older brothers, in May 1775. And like his older brothers, he was educated in mainland France. Was he intending for a career in the military or the clergy or something different?
Actually, both at different times. Initially, it seems that his father has him lined up for a position in the army. And when he's 8 years old, Lucien is taken off to France and placed with Napoleon at the military school at Brienne. So his dad's clearly got an idea that Lucien can become an officer and that Napoleon will mentor him in this. But Lucien doesn't really take to Brienne and doesn't actually take to Napoleon at the time either. He doesn't seem to get on well, unlike Louis later. Lucien doesn't like Napoleon's mentoring, doesn't like being told what to do, doesn't like his guidance. And he therefore also takes against military service. He's with Napoleon at Brienne for a year, then Napoleon leaves and Lucien is there for 2 more years. But when he's 11 years old, he decides that military life really isn't for him. And a year after his father's death in 1786, Lucien is moved to a seminary to study for the clergy, which of course was a career that Joseph had been earmarked for and then dropped out of. But in 1789, at the age of only 14, Lucien also finishes with the seminary and leaves without completing his study. So having been earmarked for the military and for the clergy, he ends up becoming neither.
Yeah, I find that to be characteristic of his life. It seems like he can't really figure out what he wants to do, like long term with his life, and I think that kind of comes up and again and again.
Yeah, and he really doesn't seem to take to kind of structures of command very well either, which is going to be a problem if you want to be in either the church or the army, I suppose.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned 1789, the French Revolution breaks out. Lucien's basically just a teenager, but he becomes an outspoken supporter of the revolution and a staunch Jacobin. And we've heard this term many times on the podcast before. Can you explain exactly what is the Jacobin Party and what that's all about?
So the Jacobins come about in this moment of chaos of the early French Revolution. Basically, when the French Revolution breaks out, people across France begin to talk about politics for the first time. And one way they start to do this is in political clubs, where like-minded people can go to hear talks, speeches, discuss ideas, etc. And the Jacobins is one of these clubs. It's founded in 1789 by some deputies of the Estates General who basically want to limit royal power. And it gets its name from where it meets, which in Paris is the Couvent des Jacobins. And as time goes on from 1789 to 92, this group becomes more and more radical, and it becomes kind of on the cutting edge of radicalism of the revolution. Starts off against royal absolutism, drifts into republicanism, and then becomes much more egalitarian, and also begins to spread its idea across France. So by the time we get to 1793, there are hundreds of these branches of Jacobin clubs across France where people can go and discuss politics, and they're all pretty radical. So by 1793, this group is aiming to tear down all the vestiges of the old regime, to replace it with a rationally run country, a country run by popular will. They're anti-monarchy, anti-aristocratic, somewhat anti-clerical, increasingly nationalist, they're egalitarian, and they believe in a unitary rather than a federal republic. So these are the radicals of the revolution who are pushing France from anything to do with monarchy or the old regime towards this kind of new, very forward-looking, very egalitarian republicanism.
Interesting. Yeah, and I know Lucien and the other Bonaparte brothers go to these clubs quite often. And I think this is where later on he comes in conflict with Pasquale Paoli. In 1791, Lucien becomes the secretary of the famed Corsican freedom fighter and statesman Paoli. But the Bonaparte family soon has a falling out with him. Do you know what happened there?
Yeah, so Lucien's only 16 when he takes this post with Paoli, but he's an idealist. He has strong opinions. He strikes me as a bit cocky, really. Basically, he's a 16-year-old boy who's full of himself. Mm-hmm. But he, more than Napoleon perhaps, believes that Corsica's future lies with revolutionary France. And that's where this divide starts, because Paoli is a Corsican nationalist, and by 1793, Paoli is saying, Corsica needs to break away from France and be its own place. And Lucien is going the other way and saying, no, we need to be part of this great revolution. And so this 18-year-old now, Lucien, basically shouts his mouth off against Paoli and denounces him as a traitor, and says that France needs to bring Paoli to heel and keep Corsica as part of it. And this causes a real rift between the families. Obviously, Napoleon has already fallen out with Paoli, and so the Bonaparte clan is basically thrown into a power struggle between themselves and the Corsican nationalists. They have an idea that they might win, but pretty soon they're disabused of that notion. A mob trashes their house. The family is forced to flee just before the house is stormed and ransacked. And basically, the Bonaparte family ends up landing on the southern French coast, virtually penniless, homeless, almost friendless. And it's not quite Lucien who's brought this about. Napoleon had played a big role in this as well. But he plays a key role actually in seeing his family run out of their ancestral home. Fortunately, of course, for the family, it's the influence of Joseph that actually gets them back on their feet, including helping to get his younger brother Napoleon the post of the commander of the artillery at Toulon, And of course, the rest there is history.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing story. Yeah, as you mentioned, Lucien and his family kind of settle in France and supports Napoleon's efforts in the Army of Italy in 1796, 1797. And I think basically on the coattails of Napoleon in 1798, Lucien gets elected as a member of the Council of 500, and within a year becomes president of that council. Was he a talented politician, like a deaf politician, or was he just simply riding on Napoleon's coattails?
Probably a bit of both, I'd say. It's definitely through his influence and through Napoleon's influence, through Joseph's influence, that Lucien gets his seat. But he's also clearly a very good orator. He's well schooled in politics and political allegory. He talks a lot in classical allusions, which is fashionable at the time. He's passionate, he's idealistic, and these are all things that would make him stand out on his own. But crucially, he's also, at this time, only 23 years old. And the French Constitution says that only men over 25 can be elected.
Mm.
But Lucien is also quite lucky because the new regime, the Directory, is struggling with threats from royalists and from radicals. And basically, it starts to rig elections to fill the assemblies with reliable men. And if they don't get the results that they want in the elections, they declare the election of various candidates null and void and put their own candidates in place. But of course, this causes unrest, and so they call in the army to quell any discontent.
Right.
So in order to keep one of their top generals happy, Napoleon, they agree that Lucien, although he's only 23 years old, should be accepted as a candidate, and his election should be ruled legal while ruling that of his rivals illegal. Joseph's already pretty key in this as well, because Joseph is already a member of the Council of 500, and he lobbies for his brother quite hard. So it's through wanting to keep Napoleon happy and through Joseph's lobbying that Lucien gets his position. But once he's there, he makes the best of it and proves himself to be a passionate, idealistic, and very clever orator as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. And I think the following year is probably Lucien's biggest contribution to the Napoleonic epic. Let's talk about the 18 Brumaire coup, where Lucien plays a big role. There's a famous, it's actually one of the best parts of the Napoleon movie. There's a dramatic moment where Lucien threatens to run a sword through Napoleon's chest if he ever betrays the Republic of France. How integral do you think he was in getting Napoleon successfully made first consul? It looks great in the movie. There's a lot of drama, and of course, it's been played up a lot in the epic. What do you think his role there was?
I actually think, again, that's one of the best parts of the movie, because for all that it's been criticized in parts, and maybe it's a bit overdone at the time in that part of the movie, it really does show Napoleon completely losing his head and Lucien having to step in and be the cool head who takes control of the situation. In my view, Lucien is the single reason that this coup works. Napoleon, for varying reasons, doesn't have a good day at all. He doesn't cover himself in glory in any way. It's the 19th of Brumaire, that's the day after the kind of coup is launched. They've taken the assemblies outside Paris. They've said, there's a threat to you. We best surround you with troops. And when they're surrounded with troops, basically the plan is Napoleon browbeats them into giving up power. But what happens is Napoleon goes into the upper house, the Council of Elders. He makes a rambling speech that goes on for too long. People don't know what's going on. He then leaves there and then walks into the Council of 500, where he's taken so long with the elders that the 500 have started to kind of mutter about, treason and sedition. And again, he gives this hesitant, stumbling, rambling speech. People shout him down. And in the end, he has to be rescued by his grenadiers, who drag him out of the chamber. And at this point, Napoleon's lost his head. He starts ranting outside. He's talking about people trying to stab him. The legislative guard, who are kind of guarding the chamber, have no idea what's going on. There's just this madman rambling. So Lucien is the man that steps up. And he, first of all, denounces the 500 in the chamber and says to them, look, you're not listening to me as your president. You're clearly no longer friends of liberty. I resign on the spot, and throws down his symbols of office. He then goes out and speaks to the commander of the legislative guard and says, the men in there are no longer representing France. They represent only their own interests. Me and my brother represent France. If I thought my brother was going to attack the Constitution and the Republic, I would kill him now. And he draws his sword and has this great symbolic gesture. And And this really wins over the Guard. Now, Napoleon had other troops there who could have probably mowed through the Legislative Guard to get to the Assembly, but that would have been a coup with bloodshed.
Right.
As it was, Lucien rallies the Guard, and they turn on the legislature, march in with leveled bayonets, disperse the Assembly, break the resistance.
Yeah.
And Lucien actually goes further than that as well, because he's a smart man who realizes that having turfed out the Assembly, you've broken the resistance, but you haven't got any legality. So he then has the soldiers round up half the legislature, bring them back in, and then make them vote that everything that's just been done was entirely legal, make them abolish themselves, and make them appoint Napoleon consul. So for me, Lucien not only saves the coup, but he also ensures this veneer of legality that would make other people accept it as well. So I think, Lucien, and he bigs himself up in later years, but he really is the savior of the day.
Yeah, you wonder, like, if Lucien wasn't there or hadn't stepped up, would there have been bloodshed, and would it have been successful at all? That's a good point.
Yeah, there may have been success, but it could have been success with bloodshed, which would have led to, strife across France. Napoleon would never have been able to paint himself as appointed by the will of the people in the way that he later can.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Well, after Napoleon takes power, he rewards Lucien, making him Minister of the Interior in December 1799. How does Lucien perform in this role?
Well, Lucien's a good politician, but he's not cut out to be an administrator, really. And that's really what Napoleon wants from his ministers. Lucien doesn't like the day-to-day work. He actually at one point has a seal made with his signature, so his secretary could just stamp official documents rather than bothering him with having to sign them. So he's not really doing the work. And there are a few good things happen when he's in charge. He sets up the system of prefects, selects the first men to be prefects, and helps put in place this system, which is still how France is run today.
Mm-hmm.
He begins to look at the deplorable state of education, which is good. Gets attention on that. But actually, he spends more of his time cultivating journalists and men of letters, which is part of his minister's remit, to make sure that journalists write the right things.
Right.
But really, he's there for his own glory, not for the department. He also, of course, gets blamed for rigging the plebiscite on the Constitution, which he did by simply adding thousands of votes to the yes pile. He rounds up departmental numbers. He adds men from the army to vote, etc. So he rigs that. So he doesn't have a great reputation. In his defense, though, his wife does become seriously ill in the spring of 1800 when he's been in post about 4 months. And then she dies the following month. And Lucien is absolutely grief-stricken by this. He had been utterly devoted to his wife, and her loss really hits him hard. He then spends the next few months, across the entire summer of 1800, pretty much drinking, gambling, whoring. He's in entire dissipation. He's just not doing any work whatsoever, ignoring his job entirely. So his ministry then becomes pretty much a corrupt shambles.
Right.
So his time as minister is pretty disastrous, but there is a vague mitigation there.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out about his wife. But I know Napoleon is, when it comes to work ethic, beyond compare, but it seems like his siblings didn't have that same energy or drive.
Absolutely. They seem to have been appointed to these posts where they think the post is for show and for their own glory rather than for working hard. I'll maybe give Joseph and Louis a slight pass on this because they work hard as monarchs, not always effectively, but they do work hard.
Right.
But certainly Lucien and Jerome are two men who don't like the day-to-day work that comes with having high positions.
Yeah. Well, I guess Napoleon kind of forgives him somewhat, but it's almost like an exile. But he makes him ambassador to Spain, where it seems he's well received by the royal court there. How do he do as a diplomat?
He does well because of what is going on in Franco-Spanish relations, which is that Spain is really trying to court France, to cultivate France, and get a favorable alliance. The ambassadorship is basically compensation for being sacked as Minister of the Interior or told to resign. And Lucien quite enjoys it because the Spanish king and queen go out of their way to show him favor, shower him with gifts. Some of these are probably attempts at bribery, essentially, because some of these gifts are huge, including one of 500,000 francs worth of diamonds.
Wow.
A vast sum of money. which isn't just a friendly gift. And it's interesting that at the same time as this, Britain is actually talking about bribing Joseph Bonaparte with hundreds of thousands of pounds to try to get a more favourable peace treaty. So clearly the powers of Europe think that they can bribe their way through Napoleon's brothers into influencing French policy. But in any case, Lucien enriches himself enormously in this ambassadorship. He has a great time in Spain. He's feted. He has a lot of balls, parties. He signs a few treaties, which actually had been written for him before he went, and he gets the credit for those. So he seems to have quite a nice time. He also presents Napoleon with an idea, actually, of divorcing Josephine and marrying a Spanish princess, which Napoleon rejects out of hand. But even that doesn't damage this ambassadorship. But after a few months, his ambassadorship also starts to come under a cloud, because in summer of 1801, he's put in charge of negotiating on behalf of France and Spain with Portugal. France and Spain had been threatening to invade Portugal unless Portugal left Britain's alliance. Lucien is given the task of negotiating the treaty that will follow.
That's a tough.
Yeah, it was always going to be a difficult one, and unfortunately for Lucien, he has his head turned by a rather large gift of diamonds that the Portuguese give to him. And so he writes a treaty, sends it to ratification to Napoleon, and Napoleon is furious because this treaty for him doesn't get enough concessions. It's sloppy. It doesn't have the proper diplomatic forms. But when he writes back to Lucien and says, well, we could do better with this, Lucien refuses to renegotiate and says, no, this is my treaty. If you don't like it, send someone else. And there's a back and forth for a while. And in the end, Paris sends a new treaty to Lucien and says, just sign that and get the Portuguese to sign it and the Spanish to sign it, which he does. But Lucien is insulted by this. And so immediately after the signing of the treaty, he just heads back to France without waiting for any kind of recall, without taking leave of the Spanish monarch, as kind of politeness dictates. So he shows himself to be quite petulant at the end as well. And when he gets back to France, he actually expects Napoleon to really scream at him and to be out of favor. But actually, Napoleon's in a forgiving mood for once and actually receives him quite amicably when he gets back to Paris, despite the diplomatic faux pas.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I know if there's one thing that drove Napoleon crazy is when you left your post without permission. I remember there's a great story on General St-Cyr who didn't want to serve under Massena, so he just left and went back to Paris. And Napoleon said, if you're still here in the afternoon, I'll have you shot, if you don't go back to your post. And I know that really bothered Napoleon when people did that without permission.
Yeah, for Napoleon, these were chess pieces that he'd put in place for a reason.
Yeah.
And, he didn't mind recalling them occasionally, but if they left without his permission, that was not acceptable. And Lucien here really was risking Napoleon's good favor, but he was lucky to catch Napoleon on a good day when he got back to Paris. And the fallout doesn't seem to have been major at that stage.
Well, let's get to the major part. In 1804, Lucien has a major rift with Napoleon and goes into self-imposed exile in Italy. Do we know what happened between these two?
I think it's a long-term relationship kind of breakdown, really. As we've already mentioned, in the 1780s, when they're at school, Lucien's already resenting Napoleon's dominance. And I think that by 1803-4, Lucien had really become quite resentful that Napoleon didn't seem to recognize his talents, didn't seem to be giving him higher office, wasn't recognizing him as a potential heir with the empire in prospect. Lucien seems to be thinking that Napoleon's being too dominant and not giving him enough credit. Napoleon, on the other hand, seems to think that Lucien is unreliable, can't quite be trusted, that he won't do the hard work. He does give him some important posts, like in the tribunate, but Lucien doesn't seem to be buying into everything that Napoleon's doing. There's also a problem that, Lucien still has these friends in the journalists and occasionally makes indiscreet comments like, if I was in charge of France, things would be better. Obviously doesn't go down well with Napoleon. But the real turning point comes in May 1803 when Lucien's mistress gives birth. And Lucien, who is a relatively honourable man, it seems, he does the decent thing and marries her so that this is a legitimate child. But he marries her secretly because he knows that Napoleon's not going to be particularly pleased about this.
Right. He wants his family members to marry other royals within Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. So by May 1803, he's already got the hereditary principle of the first consulship, and he wants to build this dynasty. He's already thinking in terms of empire, even though the empire's a year off, um,
Mm.
and he wants these marriages. So he actually, a few weeks after Lucian's secret marriage, calls Lucian to him and says, "Look, great opportunity. The Queen of Etruria needs a husband. Why don't you go down there as ambassador, woo her, marry her, and become king of Etruria?" And Lucien refuses, but he can't really say why because he hasn't told Napoleon he's already married. And this is a small rift, and Napoleon, starts to see him as a bit unreliable. Um, but in October 1803, then, when Lucien decides he's going to announce his secret marriage to the world, this really annoys Napoleon because he realizes that the reason that Lucien hadn't gone along with his wishes was he was secretly married. He sees it as a mark of utter disrespect. He thinks it's foolish. He thinks that Lucien's undermining what he's trying to do with the hereditary principle. So they have a bit of a big falling out. And Lucien storms off from Paris for a few months, goes off to Italy. But Napoleon's mother intervenes and reconciles the brothers a bit, gets Napoleon to be a bit more conciliatory. And Napoleon basically gives Lucien an offer and says, "Okay, you're married. We can't do anything about that. But I will refuse ever to speak to your wife or acknowledge her as your wife, but you can live with her. That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but as long as you accept that the Bonaparte family will never accept her, that's okay." Uh, but Lucien, again, slightly honourable man, so he says no. You either accept my wife and me, or we have nothing to do with you. And so the break pretty much becomes irretrievable.
Yeah.
Um, Lucien is almost tempted back when Napoleon is looking to sort out the line of succession, because he obviously doesn't have a child at this point. He's got Louis's children, who he kind of picks as his successors. But Joseph and Lucien both persuade Napoleon to put them in the line of succession first. And Lucien's almost got himself there as kind of third in line for the crown. But then Napoleon says, well, the only way that can happen is if all of your offspring by this new wife are excluded.
Mm.
And Lucien, of course, refuses again. Napoleon at that time decides his brother's entirely untrustworthy, excludes him from the succession. Lucien decides that Napoleon doesn't respect him, doesn't respect his family and his wife. He goes off in a sulk. And so from the middle of 1804, pretty much, there's this big rift between the brothers that can't be fixed. Lucien does try to later dress this up in his memoirs as a falling out between Lucien's Republican sympathies and Napoleon's autocratic tendencies, but it really isn't that. This is down to Lucien resenting his brother's dominance, refusing to do what he's told, and Napoleon losing patience with a brother who actually wants to live his own life.
It's interesting because you can kind of see both sides of the coin there. Like I can see Lucian's argument and I can see Napoleon's argument. And like you said at the beginning, Lucien was somewhat pig-headed and stubborn, but so was Napoleon.
Yeah, and I respect Lucien entirely for saying, well, okay, my reward here would be to be part of the imperial family and to be part of the succession, but I'm not willing to compromise my principles or my marriage to be part of that. So, he lives on his own terms after that, and you've got to respect that.
Yeah, I do. And it's just an interesting take on Lucien, who, he basically moves out to Italy and lives in the Papal States for a while on his estates. But the French army eventually takes over the Papal States, and Lucien's basically a prisoner there, isn't he?
Yeah, pretty much. He's not placed under house arrest as such, but he can't leave his home without the permission of the military district governor, and he feels like a prisoner. So he tries to get out of there essentially, and he's got a few projects of where to go.
It's interesting though because he attempts to escape to the U.S. but is captured by the British, and it almost seems like I'm sure he didn't mean to get captured by the British, but he's almost intent on embarrassing Napoleon. What does he do while he's in England?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think he's planning to be captured necessarily. He does, when he kind of is found by the British, asked first to live in Sardinia, and then they offer him Malta, but then they decide, okay, we'll move him to England. And when he moves to England, he is cheered when he lands by huge crowds who assume that he's kind of rejected Napoleon and come to live in this free country of England. So the newspapers report him as a big anti-Bonapartist, but I don't think he ever was. He actually retires to a country estate where he starts to write some literature. I think he's writing an epic poem on Charlemagne or something through a couple of years. He's really popular with the local gentry because he's quite a curiosity. And some people try to get him to intrigue against Napoleon, but he's not interested in that. He just wants to live quietly, I think, and actually he does for a few years just live quite quietly in the English countryside.
Yeah, and basically stays out of affairs for quite a while until Napoleon's abdication in 1814. Lucien returns to France, and then when Napoleon escapes Elba and returns to power in 1815, Lucien rallies to his cause during the 100 Days. What do you think led to their reconciliation?
Partly, I imagine it was a desire to reconcile with his family, who he hadn't really seen properly for a few years. Partly, it was probably to be important again, at the heart of affairs in France. And partly, maybe because Napoleon does put on a slightly more liberal face with his government this time, which is more in keeping with with Lucien's principles anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But Lucien always was ambitious, and it seems that, like for all the other brothers, apart from Louis, 1815 is a chance for him to start again and perhaps to get power again. And from Napoleon's point of view, he needs all the allies he can get in 1815, so he's probably willing to put up with his brother's whims and to put aside any former antagonisms and welcome this assistance from Lucien, who is still essentially quite an able politician.
Yeah, it's interesting that they were able to have a reconciliation, which I think is good for both brothers. But obviously, Napoleon loses at Waterloo. Shout out to your book that's coming out soon. After Napoleon's second abdication, though, Lucien goes in exile again. What does he do in his later years?
Well, he lives in exile for the next kind of 25 years of his life. They go off to Italy for quite a time. He and his wife are still living together. They continue to have children until 1823. So he lives out his life in exile pretty much as a quiet country gentleman. He's accrued quite a lot of money over the years and is able, obviously, to rely on hospitality and friendship of varying supporters. So he lives quietly until his death in 1840.
Yeah, it's interesting. He dies of stomach cancer, which also killed his dad and Napoleon. What do you think his legacy is, though, both within the Bonaparte family and overall?
I see him somewhat as a kind of missed opportunity brother in some ways. He's a man with talent, a man with ambition, and had he been slightly more conciliatory with Napoleon, had Napoleon been slightly more conciliatory with him, he could have been a real asset. He wasn't necessarily one of the few people who would tell Napoleon the truth on everything, but he would certainly highlight criticisms of Napoleon. And towards the end of the empire, Napoleon needed someone like that with him. So I think it's a missed opportunity for Lucien to have done more. As it is, his legacy is a thorn in Napoleon's side, a bit of a pest, but a man who did that not deliberately.
Yeah, I think you're right on that point. Like he didn't say, "Oh, well, let me sabotage my brother's life." I think he just stuck to those principles, and when those didn't align with Napoleon's or the empires, that's when the conflict started.
Yeah, really, that's how we can sum him up. A man who had some principles. They didn't charm with Napoleon's. A man who didn't take well to being told what to do, and therefore it just didn't work out.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I thank you for that. That was a good summary on Lucien Bonaparte, and really interesting stuff. Thank you so much, Graham.
That's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and the name of the book again is Waterloo: Attack of the First Corps, which is the French d'Erlon's Corps, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, very good. Should be out soon, and we thank Graham for coming on the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.